wanted to talk about the effects of World War I really across the 20th century, to ask about, if you like, the long-term effects, and in a way expanding on some of the points Jeremy has made on if you like, World War I and the making of the modern world. I'd like to start with two quotes. The first is from somebody called Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, who was a veteran of World War I in the German army, and he was also a member of the paramilitary sort of proto-Nazi Freikorps. And he wrote a book in 1929 about the experiences of his generation in the German and Austrian-Hungarian armies, generation that fought in the trenches, that was defeated, and experienced the frustrations of that defeat and also the revolutions that happened in that period, in that area after the war. And he, of course, joined the forces of the fascistic, if you like, far-right counter-revolution. And he wrote, "When we were 17, the calling of our blood drove us into the trenches. When they told us that the war was over, we laughed, because we ourselves were the war. Its flame continued to burn in us. It lived on in our deeds, surrounded by a glowing and frightful aura of destruction. We followed our inner calling and marched onto the battlefields of the post-war period, just as we had marched towards the front. We were singing, full of recklessness and adventurism whilst marching. We were grim, silent, and merciless in combat." So that's a voice from the right. And now the second quote is a rather more surprising voice from the left, or sort of left. Now this is Thomas Mann, who some of you will know as a rather heavy, quite a sort of bourgeois author, celebrated middle-class life and middle-class values in Germany. And he wrote in his diary, March 1918, quote, "Rise up against the demagogical bourgeois, a national uprising, even in the form of communism. I'm perfectly willing to take to the streets and yell, 'Down with the lie of Western democracy. Long live Germany and Russia, long live communism.'" Now, actually, his support for communism is rather surprising. It was very short-lived, and actually he became a great stalwart of the Rotary Club in Munich in the late 1920s. So this is rather a sort of weird aberration. But I suppose both of those quotes show, and could be used to support a very common argument made by historians, that World War I led to a general support for violence, for a militaristic politics, which, if you like, ultimately led to the great catastrophes of the 20th century. Many historians have talked about the militarization of Europe, of the beginning of a European civil war between left and right that ended up with the Holocaust. George Kennan, the great American statesman, Cold War statesman, said that World War I was, quote, "the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century because it led to so many other catastrophes. This was, as some historians have put it, the flap of the butterfly's wings that set off the subsequent hurricanes, Nazism, Stalinism, World War II, the Holocaust." And some historians of the right, people like Neil Ferguson, I suppose, in a recent debate on TV, argued that had it not been for World War I, had Britain not confronted Germany, the 20th century would have been a much nicer and gentler affair. Now, in this brief talk, I just want to ask if this is true, or do I agree with this? And I suppose I want to argue two things. I think I would agree that World War I had major consequences. I mean, it's in a way one of those events, as Jeremy said, which is of world historical significance, and in some ways more fundamental than World War II, which continued and intensified many of the processes that it initiated. And as I argued in the book that Martin mentioned, Merchant Soldier Sage, A History of Power, I think that the main change was the challenge it posed to the old aristocratic and imperial order, which still survived in 1914 to a large extent. But it was the first, in a way, one of the most significant power shifts, as I call it, in the modern world. But I think it is also a bit simplistic to say that it somehow caused fascism and communism, that fascism and communism wouldn't necessarily have happened without it. And also I think we have to remember, and I think Jeremy was hinting at this as well, that while it undoubtedly did have negative effects, very many negative effects, of course it was horrible to fight it, it also had effects that we, as 21st century liberals, I suppose, as many of us are, would think of as positive. And I mean, history is amoral. And what we think of today commonly as progress, in many ways, is something that is brought by war. Now, firstly, on the question of this issue about the connection between World War I and the militarisation of culture, and within fascism and communism. And if I could look at, see two images here. Okay, so that is clearly the Nazis, and as you see, they are very much a militarised organisation. They're wearing uniforms. It's a militarised regime. And it makes sense to see Nazism as coming out of that, if you like, World War I culture. But also, in the 20s, we see a similar effect on communism. And if we look at the Ernst Thälmann in the 20s, the communist leader in the 20s, again, you see, of course, they're rather more proletarianly dressed, if you like, but they're wearing uniforms. In a way, the culture of politics, but particularly on the radical left and the radical right, was very much militarised. Also, I think, as many historians have said, I think it's fair to say that the victory of communist regimes and these really quite militarised communist regimes, militarised by the war and the civil war in Russia, this probably would not have happened, I think, had it not been for World War I. That's not to say there weren't many social tensions in Russia at the time, but the victory of this Bolshevik Marxist-Leninist group probably would not have happened were it not for World War I. Now, some have talked about militarisation more generally of culture in the World War I period, and we see that actually in fashion. So here we see the fashion for the trench coat, 1920s, and the 30s it became a fashion for women, and that replaced the rather bourgeois wear, more bourgeois wear that Thomas Mann was wearing, the sort of late pre-World War I period. Now that is, of course, rather a trivial example, but in a way it's an important example. I think one can say that that culture more generally became, well, militarised, but also informal, less formal. And you could say that the less formal fashion, if you like, was often quite liberating for women. For instance, the more sporty, more masculine fashion after World War I, that was designed by people like Coco Chanel, for instance, was part of at least an element in some form of women's liberation. So I think it's not surprising that World War I should have had this major effect on culture, because as Jeremy said, the war just had an enormous impact on all aspects of life. I mean, this was the war in which everybody, whether front or rear, was effectively mobilised. Many workers in Europe were subject to military discipline, as much as soldiers were. So often people working in factories were treated in exactly the same way as soldiers would be, and you could be very strongly disciplined for labour indiscipline. Also, I think if we move away from Britain and we look to the continent, the war continued for a very long time, and on the east, particularly in the former Russian Empire, civil wars continued after 1918, long after 1918. Also, I think the argument that war militarises politics domestically does have something to it. Returning soldiers in Germany and Austria do radicalise politics, do militarise it. Leaders like Stalin cut their teeth in the Russian Civil War, and quite a lot of his military style emerges in that period. That's the civil war that lasted from about 1917 to 21. And of course, the violence following during the struggle for Irish independence was partly fueled by veterans coming back and engaging in paramilitary violence, like the Black and Tans. However, I would argue that the notion that the war itself, the war alone, if you like, created this new militarized political culture that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century is a bit simplistic. Clearly, politics and context matters. People returning to Britain did not fuel radical politics. But they did fuel radical politics, or a militarized politics, if you like, where the pre-existing social situation was fraught and divided. Also, there were other things that happened apart from the war that fueled radicalization, particularly the Depression 29 and after 1929. So I'd argue that a better way to understand the long-term effects of World War I are less in terms of militarization of culture and more in terms of changing power politics. I think firstly, the big significant thing about World War I was that it destroyed an old elite that had dominated the world for a long period of time, European aristocracies, hierarchical, imperial and militaristic. And it created then a power vacuum which other groups fought to fill. And that wasn't just an issue of class groups or social groups, workers trying to get more power against aristocracies or middle classes. It was also about national groups, nationalist organisations struggled against, were empowered, if you like, against old empires. And secondly, it did empower ordinary people, as Jeremy said. People got much more used to being involved in the state. It accelerated, if you like, the rise of mass politics. Now, before World War I think we can still very much say that Europe was dominated by an aristocratic, old aristocratic military elite. And here is Wilhelm II and George V. Of course, all of these people were related. They were military and highly military in their culture, and believed in aristocratic values. Now, of course, the strength of the aristocracy varied from place to place. It was rather less important in Britain than it was, say, in the Romanov Russia. But I think the culture of the aristocracy, ideas of honour, military values, social exclusivity, paternalism, all of these things were pretty dominant among elites, and middle-class people aspired to them as well. These were quite fashionable things to believe in. Now, World War I, Jeremy's talked about the causes of World War I, and I don't want to talk about that really, but clearly a complex issue, and reams of paper and print have been expended on this question. But one factor, I think, is that many supporters of the war saw it as something closely connected with aristocratic ideas of honour, and Jeremy mentioned that, this idea about honour and keeping treaties, and I think it was very important, and actually, but it was very much connected with this aristocratic value system. Kaiser Wilhelm, Emperor Franz Joseph, and Herbert Asquith all justified war, explicitly using the concept of honour. They had to fight because of national honour. And Rupert, I'm sure there'll be lots of poetry read rather more expertly than by me later on today, but I'd like to read a poem by Rupert Brooke, or part of a poem, The Dead, which does talk about the return to this golden age of aristocratic chivalry. Blow, bugles blow, they brought us for our dearth, holiness, lapped so long, and love and pain. Honour has come back as a king to earth, and paid his subjects with a royal wage. And nobleness walks in our ways again, and we have come into our heritage. So war then is about returning to this lost age of chivalry and honour and aristocratic values. And of course, Brooke was a middle-class person, not an aristocrat himself. Now, if this was the expectation of what war would be, that is this wonderful chivalric thing, it's understandable why the reality caused so much disillusionment. There was very little that was chivalric about it. New military technologies, trenches, rapid-firing artillery, machine guns. This was a war of mass killing. You didn't even see the face of the person you were killing. This was hardly heroic, chivalric activity. And even the hardened aristocrat warrior, Lord Kitchener, said, I don't know what's to be done. This isn't war. This was not the war they were expecting. Now, after the war, reactions varied, depending on the country, but among many, particularly on the left, especially in the defeated powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, the disasters of war showed the bankruptcy of this old aristocratic value system. This was an aristocratic elite that had caused the deaths of millions in pursuit of its selfish and archaic pursuit of glory. As the Viennese satirist Karl Kraus wrote, quote, "Thank God for communism, to hell with its practical importance, but may God preserve it for us, as a never-ending menace to those people who own big estates and who, in order to hang on to them, are prepared to dispatch humanity into battle, to abandon it to starvation for the sake of patriotic honour." Now, I would say that is a very common response from many intellectuals. Kraus wasn't a communist before, but now he sees communism as being essential as a way of challenging this aristocratic mentality. And I think this explains why so many people supported communism in the early years after the war, the communist revolutions in Central Europe, Soviet governments in Hungary, Bavaria, Slovakia, as well as, of course, Russia, workers' councils in Italy and Spain. And World War I also contributed to communist revolutions in another way. I think it doesn't just undermine aristocratic elites, as Jeremy says. As Jeremy said, the state becomes much more involved in everyday life. It has to plan wages, it has to plan supplies. People get much more used to the state being in their lives, and if things go wrong, they start to blame the state, and they feel they've got to get involved in politics. So what this begins, if you like, is the modern mass politics. People feeling that they've got to be involved in politics in a way that many people did not. Many people felt very alien, sort of cut off from the state. The state wasn't very important to them. Now, communist revolutions, of course, failed in Central Europe, only survived in Russia. But even after the revolutions, the post-revolutionary order in much of Europe, particularly, say, Weimar Germany, these states were much more democratic, they were much more welfarist, they had bigger welfare states than before the war. Politics had changed quite fundamentally, perhaps less in Britain than elsewhere, but even in Britain and France, but certainly in Germany. And we see the extension of democracy throughout Europe. And this is in part what led to the right-wing backlash from people like Hitler, from the Freikorps people. They blamed democracy for national humiliations. They called for new, militarised, elitist politics to continue the war, which they felt they had lost unjustly due to the stab in the back from those communists. But even these movements were not calling for a return to aristocracy. They were calling for a new populist order. In a way, a more democratic. I know it's difficult to call the Nazi movement democratic, but it's more populist, let's say. It's not elitist. And actually, interestingly, Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote that if the Prussian Imperial Army had adopted the good popular support of boxing, rather than duelling and fencing, then, quote, it would never have been possible for the bullies and deserters and other such rabble to have carried through a revolution and bring about our defeat. So he was pretty critical of Prussian elitism, as much as the left were. So, clearly, while the aftermath of World War I brought social conflict, a great deal of social conflict, brought these very radical movements and a lot of violence, it also contributed to the rise of modern politics, in which ordinary people were much more involved. And even though, of course, this was not yet the liberal democracy, it was an authoritarian democracy, if you like. But World War I did not just set in train the democratization of European politics. It also shook another aspect of aristocratic rule. The European empires. War destroyed the great land-based multi-ethnic empires. The Romanov Empire, the Hohenzollern Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire. The Qing Empire, the Chinese Empire, had fallen before World War I. I can't quite relate it to that. But the US was the new global power. Britain and France, of course, kept their empires, their overseas empires, but they were weakened by war debts, by paying for the war, and the US was the new global power, which, of course, it had had some empires, some imperial colonies in the past, but it was now calling for a new world order based on national self-determination, at least in Europe. And the 1920s, so it challenges this, this imperial order as well as the social order. Now the 1920s, the system stabilised itself, but in 1929 it collapses again. The forces World War I had set in train, the social conflicts, the post-imperial conflicts continued as the Nazis and the communists struggled for power. The Germans tried and failed to recreate their empire. And only after World War II can we see these forces stabilised, with the Soviet Empire in the East and the US, if you like, empire by invitation, as it's often called in the West. The war between left and right had been tamed by parliamentary democracy within Western states, and in terms of the borders, the geopolitics of this, the Cold War, if you like, froze, stabilised those conflicts. But importantly, this was not the case outside Europe. Notoriously, Woodrow Wilson refused to apply the principles of national self-determination at Versailles to the non-European world. The British and the French empires were given new territory by the League of Nations. And here we have Ho Chi Minh, the young Ho Chi Minh, who had just finished his apprenticeship to the chef Escoffier as a pastry chef. But he is in the French socialist delegation to Versailles, and he hands a petition to Woodrow Wilson asking for Vietnamese independence, and he gets a very polite rebuff, not from Wilson himself, from his advisor. But there's a very good example of this nationalist unrest which came in the aftermath of World War I, which we often forget about. There were nationalist, if you like, unrest in China, Korea, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Morocco. This was also fueled the Gandhian, rather more peaceable nationalist movement. And the Americans refused to, if you like, this issue of European aristocratic empire had not been resolved. Now, after a brief bout of anti-imperialism after World War II, the US then, in a way, continued this tension because it, as part of the Cold War, it adopted the role of the old European empires. It saw itself as, of course it didn't call itself this, but it became a quasi-imperialist power in the Third World, and as part of its attempts to resist communism. And this, in a way, fueled the support for communism in the Third World in the 60s and 70s. And so, if you like, the power vacuum caused or initiated by the post-World War I power vacuum, or post-World War I crisis, that power vacuum, if you like, had been solved in a social sense, but in terms of empire, it had not been solved. And one could say it was only solved, was it solved with the end of the Cold War? Possibly. It could be said that 1989 was the end of the era, this sort of post-World War I era. That is to say, many of these questions of Western imperialism were resolved. But That's not to say we have entered an era of eternal peace, as Kant dreamed of, but the major conflicts have become rather different to the ones that emerged in the post-World War I era. Now it seems to me that we are increasingly divided between a cosmopolitan pro-globalization group and more anti-globalization people. These are rather different divisions to the ones between imperialists and colonized, or if you like, quasi-imperialists and quasi-colonized during the Cold War period. But in some regions, I think we do see the remnants of these struggles. And interestingly, I think the Middle East is a crucial one. The boundaries of the modern Middle East were established in the aftermath of World War I. The Middle East, if you like, empire was intensified, not challenged, after World War I in the Middle East. And this, in a way, is what many forces in the Middle East have been arguing, have been trying to challenge recently. The whole argument about the issue of Western imperialism, as it's perceived, is still very much a live one. And the major boundary between Iraq and Syria, this famous Sykes-Picot line, is, of course, now being challenged by the ISIS, the Islamic State fighters. And here is a picture of an Islamic State fighter looking at the Sykes-Picot line, which was drawn in the aftermath drawn by Sykes-Picot, Britain and France, dividing up the Middle East between the two mandates in the aftermath of World War I. One could also say that Chinese-Japanese relations, which are of course a huge tinderbox issue in East Asia, if you like, you could say that also was intensified by Versailles, which handed handed some of the European possessions in China to Japan. The Japan-China tensions had pre-existed World War I, but anyway, many of those tensions go back to that pre-World War I and World War I era. One could even say that Russia's activity in Ukraine, Russia's activity in Ukraine is partly connected with a continuing tension over this borderland region, and Putin is, people say he's fighting for the Soviet Union, or to restore the Soviet Union. In many ways he is fighting for what he calls New Russia, Novorossiya, the area that was occupied during the Romanov era. Now, apparently, Zhou Enlai's famous answer to the question, what are the effects of the French Revolution, is too soon to tell. Apparently this quip or answer is not a sign of deep Chinese wisdom. As we've discovered quite recently, the question was actually mistranslated. And he thought that Nixon was talking about the May 1968 revolution, not the French Revolution. But why let the facts get in the way of a good quotation and a good story, even if it's become a bit of a cliche quotation? But certainly, events in the Middle East today suggest that World War I, along with the French Revolution, not sure about May 1968, falls into the category of major historical events to which Zhou Enlai could have made his famous comment.